The day I stood up for a homeless woman, I had no idea the most powerful man in the city was watching. The wind cut through my coat like a knife as I hurried down West 57th Street, after another long Thursday at Jefferson Elementary. December in New York had a way of finding every gap in your clothing, every weakness in your defenses. My fingers ached around the paper cup of coffee I'd grabbed from a corner deli, and the steam rising from the lid disappeared almost instantly into the cold evening air. At 27, my life was painfully ordinary. I taught third grade. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Queens. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a heater that only worked when it felt like it. Most days I was invisible, just another person moving through the city with her head down and her mind occupied by lesson plans, grocery lists, and overdue utility bills. That evening should have been no different. The sidewalks were crowded with people rushing home. Business professionals in expensive coats, tourists staring up at skyscrapers, delivery drivers weaving through traffic on bicycles. Nobody looked at each other. Nobody slowed down. New York had taught us all the same lesson. Keep moving. Mind your own business. Pretend not to notice. Then I heard the shouting. It wasn't loud enough to stop the crowd, but it was loud enough to make me turn my head. Across the street, outside an upscale grocery store with polished windows and holiday decorations, a security guard stood over an older woman sitting on the pavement. She looked to be in her 60s, maybe older. Layers of worn clothing hung loosely from her thin frame. Gray hair escaped from beneath a knitted hat. A small cart filled with blankets and plastic bags sat beside her. The guard pointed toward the sidewalk with obvious frustration. The woman seemed to be explaining something, her voice too soft to reach me over the traffic. People walked around them without slowing. Some glanced over briefly before continuing on. Others pretended not to see anything at all. I should have kept walking too. I had papers to grade. My apartment was 45 minutes away. The temperature was dropping fast. But something about the woman's face stopped me. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she kept apologizing even though she didn't appear to have done anything wrong. Or maybe it was because she reminded me of my grandmother, who used to tell me that kindness was only real when it cost you something. Before I realized what I was doing, I was crossing the street. The light changed while I was halfway through the intersection, but I kept moving. The wind whipped through my hair as I stepped onto the sidewalk and approached them. The security guard looked surprised when I stopped beside the woman. "Is there a problem?" I asked. He sighed heavily. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "Maybe not," I replied. "But it looks like she's freezing." The woman looked up at me with tired blue eyes. For a second, something flickered across her face. Not hope exactly. More like disbelief. As though she couldn't remember the last time someone had bothered to ask a question. Around us, the city continued moving. Cars honked. Pedestrians hurried past. Holiday music drifted from a nearby storefront. Nobody stopped. Nobody cared. Except me. And somewhere beyond the reflections of glass and city lights, inside a black SUV parked quietly across the street, a pair of unseen eyes had just fixed themselves on me for the very first time. The security guard rubbed his forehead as if I had just become the most inconvenient part of his evening. Snowflakes drifted through the glow of the streetlights, catching briefly in the air before disappearing against the crowded sidewalk. The older woman pulled her coat tighter around herself and lowered her eyes. "She has been sitting here for hours," the guard said. "Customers are complaining." I looked down at her. "Have you been bothering anyone?" She shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am. I was just trying to stay warm near the building." Her voice was soft and careful, the voice of someone accustomed to apologizing for taking up space. Something tightened in my chest. I had spent 7 years teaching children, and one thing I had learned was how to recognize loneliness. It looked different at every age, but it always carried the same weight. "She is not hurting anyone," I said. The guard exhaled slowly. "Look, I do not make the rules." Then maybe the rules need work. A few people nearby slowed their pace. Not enough to help. Just enough to watch. The woman seemed embarrassed by the attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the handle of her cart. I crouched beside her. "Have you eaten dinner?" For a moment she simply stared at me. Then she gave a tiny shake of her head. "Not today." The answer hit harder than I expected. Not because it was unusual. New York was full of stories people preferred not to see. But hearing it spoken out loud made it impossible to ignore. I stood and reached into my purse. The cash I carried was supposed to last until payday, but some calculations mattered more than others. I walked into the grocery store, ignoring the annoyed look from the security guard, and 10 minutes later I returned carrying 2 bags. Soup, bread, fruit, bottled water. A few extra things that might survive the cold. When I handed her the bags, her eyes widened. I cannot take all this. Yes, you can. It is too much. Trust me, I said with a small smile. My third graders bring me enough cookies every week to keep me alive. To my surprise, she laughed. It was brief and fragile, but it was there. The sound seemed to erase 10 years from her face. Around us, people continued moving through the evening rush. A businessman brushed past without looking. A couple hurried toward a taxi. Somewhere nearby, Christmas music floated from a storefront speaker. The city never stopped, just kept going. The woman carefully placed the food into her cart. "What is your name?" she asked. "Emily." Her expression softened. "I am Grace." I repeated it back to her. Grace suited her somehow. We sat together on a nearby bench for almost 20 minutes while she ate a cup of hot soup. She never asked me for money, never asked for favors. Mostly she listened while I talked about my students, about the little girl who insisted every dinosaur should wear a sweater in winter, about the boy who spent an entire week trying to convince me that recess should last 6 hours. Grace smiled at every story, yet several times I noticed her glance across the street toward the traffic, not nervously, almost thoughtfully, as though she was expecting someone. When I finally stood to leave, the cold had settled deep into my bones. "Will you be okay tonight?" I asked. Grace looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I think things are about to change." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" A strange sadness crossed her face. "Nothing, dear." Then her eyes shifted beyond my shoulder. I followed her gaze toward the opposite side of the street. A black SUV sat parked beneath the glow of a street lamp. Its windows were dark enough to hide whoever was inside. For some reason, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the weather. And before I could ask another question, the vehicle's headlights slowly came to life. The headlights remained on for only a few seconds before the SUV eased away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of traffic. I watched until the taillights vanished among hundreds of others, then turned back toward Grace. She was still staring at the street. There was something in her expression I could not quite understand. Not fear. Not relief. Recognition. The kind that comes from seeing a ghost you thought belonged to another life. "Do you know whoever was in that vehicle?" I asked. Grace blinked as though returning from a distant memory. "No," she said quietly. "At least not anymore." Before I could ask what that meant, she stood and adjusted the blanket folded inside her cart. The movement seemed to cost her effort. The cold had settled into the city completely now. Streetlights reflected off patches of old snow gathered along the sidewalks. Somewhere a siren echoed several blocks away before fading into the distance. "You should get home, Emily," Grace said. "You have children waiting for you tomorrow." I smiled. "How did you know I was a teacher?" "You talk about your students the way mothers talk about their children." The answer caught me off guard. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was worn from age. A tiny metal charm shaped like a dove. "Keep this." I frowned. "I cannot take that." "Please." She closed my fingers around it before I could protest. "Consider it a thank you." The metal felt cold against my skin. "Grace, this looks important." Her eyes softened. It was. A very long time ago. I wanted to ask more questions, but something told me she would not answer them tonight. So instead I slipped the charm into my purse and promised I would check on her again soon. She smiled. "I would like that." The subway ride back to Queens felt strangely quiet. I could not stop thinking about the black SUV, or Grace, or the odd certainty in her voice when she said things were about to change. By the time I reached my apartment, it was nearly 10 o'clock. I kicked off my boots, made a cup of tea, and sat at my tiny kitchen table surrounded by spelling tests waiting to be graded. Usually the routine calmed me. Not that night. Every few minutes my thoughts drifted back to the sidewalk outside the grocery store. Back to Grace. Back to those dark windows watching from across the street. Around midnight my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen expecting a message from another teacher. Instead it was an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. There was no greeting. No explanation. Just a single sentence. Thank you for showing kindness to someone the world forgot. I stared at the message. My heartbeat quickened. Nobody besides Grace knew where I lived. Nobody should have known my phone number. Before I could respond, another message appeared. Do not worry. She will be safe tonight. Then the conversation disappeared. Not deleted. Gone entirely. I refreshed the screen twice, thinking it had to be some kind of glitch. Nothing remained. Only an empty inbox and my reflection staring back from the dark glass of the window beside me. Somewhere across the city, in an office overlooking Manhattan, a man named Luca Moretti lowered his phone and looked at an old photograph that had not left his desk in 18 years. And for the first time since he was a boy, he believed he might finally be close to finding the answers he had spent half his life searching for. The next morning I convinced myself the text message had been a prank. It was the only explanation that made sense. By 7:30, I was standing in front of my classroom helping 8-year-olds hang paper snowflakes on the windows while pretending my life was completely normal. The scent of dry erase markers mixed with hot chocolate from the teacher's lounge drifted through the hallway. Children laughed. Chairs scraped across the floor. Everything felt familiar. Safe. Yet every time my phone vibrated in my purse, my stomach tightened. During lunch break, I finally pulled out the small silver dove Grace had given me. It rested in my palm beneath the fluorescent lights of the faculty room. The metal was older than I had realized. Tiny scratches covered its surface. Along the bottom edge, almost invisible, were 2 engraved letters. LM. I traced them with my thumb. The initials meant nothing to me, but for some reason they lingered in my thoughts for the rest of the day. When the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, I bundled up and headed back toward Manhattan instead of going home. Part of me felt foolish. Another part needed to know whether Grace was all right. The city looked different in daylight. Less mysterious. Less dramatic. The same sidewalk outside the grocery store bustled with shoppers carrying bags and rushing toward appointments. But the moment I reached the corner, I stopped. Grace was gone. The spot where her cart had stood was empty. The bench where we had shared soup sat vacant beneath a dusting of fresh snow. I searched the surrounding blocks for nearly 40 minutes. Nothing. No sign of her blankets. No sign of her belongings. No sign of Grace. Just as disappointment began settling into my chest, I noticed something tucked beneath the bench. A cream-colored envelope. My name was written neatly across the front. Emily. My pulse quickened. I looked around. Hundreds of people moved through the street, none paying attention to me. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did. The words were simple, but they carried an unexpected weight. Beneath them was a small key attached to a brass tag engraved with the number 312. That was all. No explanation. No address. No signature. I stared at the key in confusion. Miss Parker, a voice said behind me. I turned so quickly that my scarf slipped from my shoulder. A man stood several feet away. Mid-40s. Gray overcoat. Calm expression. There was something polished about him. Professional. Controlled. Can I help you? I asked cautiously. I believe that belongs to you now. His gaze dropped briefly toward the envelope in my hand. Who are you? The man smiled politely. A friend of someone who thinks very highly of your kindness. Every instinct told me to walk away. Yet curiosity rooted me in place. Do you know where Grace is? For the first time, genuine warmth entered his eyes. She is safe. Relief washed through me, so suddenly I had to exhale. Can I see her? Not today. Why not? He hesitated. Because some stories take time to unfold. Before I could ask another question, a black SUV pulled silently to the curb beside him. The same vehicle. I recognized it instantly. The rear passenger window lowered slightly. Not enough to reveal much. Just a glimpse of a man seated inside. Dark suit. Strong profile. green eyes watching me with unsettling focus. Then the window rose again. The SUV pulled away. And standing there on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk, clutching an unexplained key and a mysterious letter, I realized that whatever had started with Grace was becoming something much bigger than I understood. I barely slept that night. The brass key sat on my kitchen table beside the silver dove, and every time I walked past them, I felt the same mixture of curiosity and unease. The number 312 seemed burned into my thoughts. By 6 in the morning, I had already convinced myself of at least a dozen explanations. Maybe it was a storage unit, maybe an apartment, maybe a safety deposit box. None of them explained Grace. None of them explained the man in the SUV. None of them explained why a complete stranger seemed to know details about my life. The next day dragged painfully. My students noticed my distraction almost immediately. One of them raised his hand during a reading lesson and asked if I was feeling sick. I laughed and assured him I was fine, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. By the time school ended, my decision had been made. I was going to find out what the key opened. The address attached to the brass tag took longer to discover than I expected. After several internet searches and a subway ride downtown, I found myself standing in front of an older brick building on the Lower East Side. It was not glamorous, not mysterious, just a well-maintained residential building tucked between a bakery and a small pharmacy. Snow drifted through the afternoon air as I stepped inside. The elderly manager behind the front desk looked up from a newspaper. His expression changed the moment I showed him the key. Not alarm, recognition. "You must be Emily," he said. My stomach tightened. "How do you know my name?" "I was told to expect you." Of course he was. At that point, I was no longer surprised by anything. He motioned toward the elevator. "Third floor. Apartment 312. The ride up felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, a quiet hallway stretched before me. Apartment 312 sat near the end. I stood outside for nearly 30 seconds before finally inserting the key. The lock clicked smoothly. The apartment beyond was small but comfortable. Sunlight filtered through large windows overlooking the street. A couch, a bookshelf, a dining table, fresh flowers sitting in a vase near the kitchen. Everything looked clean and cared for. Lived in, yet completely empty. I stepped inside slowly. On the coffee table sat another envelope. This one contained a single photograph. My breath caught. Grace looked much younger in the picture. Her hair was darker, her smile brighter. Beside her stood a boy of perhaps 12 years old. Thin, serious, green eyes, familiar green eyes. I immediately thought of the man inside the SUV. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence. "Some debts are paid with money. Others are paid with kindness." I read it 3 times. The meaning remained frustratingly out of reach. Then I noticed something else resting beneath the photograph. A leather journal. Its cover was worn with age. Carefully, I opened the first page. The handwriting belonged to Grace. The entries dated back almost 2 decades. I read only a few paragraphs before my pulse began to race. The journal was not simply a diary. It was a record. Names, places, memories, and woven throughout every page was mention of a boy she had protected years ago. A boy named Luca. Suddenly the pieces shifted into a pattern. The silver dove, the initials, the photograph, the SUV. Luca Moretti. Somewhere across the city, a man I had never properly met was quietly pulling me toward a story that had started long before I entered it. And as I turned the next page of Grace's journal, I realized I was no longer certain whether I had found the mystery or whether the mystery had found me. I lost track of time inside that apartment. Outside, daylight slowly faded behind the windows while I sat on the couch turning page after page of Grace's journal. Her handwriting was neat and careful, as though every word mattered. The entries painted a picture of a woman very different from the one I had met on the sidewalk. She had once worked as a nurse. She had volunteered at shelters. She had spent years helping people nobody else noticed. Again and again, one name appeared throughout the journal. Luca. Sometimes she wrote about teaching him how to read when he was young. Sometimes she described encouraging him after difficult days. One entry stopped me completely. Some people are born into darkness, but that does not mean they belong there. Luca still smiles when he thinks nobody is watching. I read the sentence twice. It sounded less like a journal entry and more like a memory a mother might keep. The apartment suddenly felt quieter, more personal, as though every object around me carried a story I did not yet understand. A soft knock at the door startled me. My heart jumped. Nobody should have known I was there. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then the knock came again. Calm, patient. I crossed the room and opened the door a few inches. The same man in the gray overcoat stood outside. "I apologize for interrupting," he said. "But I thought you might be hungry." He held a paper bag from a nearby restaurant. The scent of fresh soup drifted through the hallway. Embarrassingly, my stomach growled immediately. I had not eaten since lunch. "Who are you?" I asked again. He smiled slightly. "My name is Daniel." "And you work for Luca?" "I have known him for many years." Not exactly an answer. He seemed aware of that. "May I come in?" Every instinct told me this situation should feel dangerous. Instead, it felt strangely normal, like stepping into a story already in progress. I allowed him inside. Daniel placed the food on the table and glanced at the journal. "You found it. Was I supposed to?" "Grace hoped you would." I folded my arms. Then maybe somebody should start explaining what is happening. For the first time, Daniel's expression became serious. "The truth is complicated. Try me." He looked toward the photograph on the coffee table, the one showing Grace beside a young Luca. 18 years ago, Grace helped a boy who had nowhere else to go. She protected him, guided him, reminded him there was still goodness in the world. His eyes shifted to me. "Last week, she watched you do the same thing for her." The room fell silent. I looked down at the photograph again. Suddenly I understood why Grace had looked at me the way she did. Not as a stranger. As a reminder. "Where is she now?" I asked quietly. Daniel relaxed slightly. "Safe. Comfortable. Somewhere warm." Relief spread through me. "Can I see her?" "Soon." The answer felt genuine. Before leaving, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper beside the journal. "What is this?" "An invitation." After he departed, I unfolded it carefully. A single address was written across the page, along with the time. 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. No explanation. No signature. Yet I already knew who was waiting there. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, I would finally come face to face with Luca Moretti. The address led me to a private restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. I arrived 10 minutes early, which only gave my imagination more time to create possibilities. The building itself looked understated from the outside. No flashing signs. No crowds. Just dark brick, warm lighting behind tall windows and a doorman, who seemed to know exactly who I was before I said a word. "Miss Parker," he greeted. "This way." My pulse quickened. The dining room was nearly empty. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Candlelight reflected across polished glass and dark wood. It felt less like a restaurant and more like a place where important conversations happen behind closed doors. The host guided me toward a private corner overlooking the river. Then he quietly stepped away. For a moment I stood alone. Then I saw him. Luca Moretti was seated near the window. The first thing I noticed was not his expensive suit or the quiet authority that seemed to surround him. It was his eyes. The same green eyes from the photograph. The same eyes I had glimpsed behind the tinted window of the SUV. He rose when I approached. Tall. Calm. Completely composed. "Emily." His voice was lower than I expected. "Thank you for coming." I sat carefully across from him. I had a feeling I was not given much choice. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You always had a choice." A server appeared with coffee before disappearing again. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. Luca seemed to study people the way teachers studied classrooms, observing first, speaking second. "Grace told you about me?" he finally asked. Not directly. I glanced toward the river. The journal filled in some gaps. Something shifted in his expression when I mentioned Grace. For the first time, the controlled businessman disappeared. In his place was someone carrying old memories. "She saved my life," he said quietly. When I was young, she was the only person who saw me as more than my circumstances. The words sounded rehearsed through years of gratitude. She seems remarkable. She is. His answer came instantly. We sat in silence again. Outside, snow drifted across the dark water. Boats moved slowly beneath distant city lights. Why me? I finally asked. Why all of this? Luca leaned back slightly. Because Grace would not stop talking about you. I blinked. What? Another faint smile appeared. The day you helped her, she called me. She spent 20 minutes telling me about a teacher who stood beside a stranger when everyone else walked away. Heat crept into my cheeks. I only bought her dinner. No, his gaze remained steady. You gave her dignity. The simple statement affected me more than I expected. For some reason, hearing it from him felt different. More personal. More honest. I looked down at my coffee. Most people would have done the same. No, Emily. His voice softened. Most people did not. The words settled between us. Then Luca reached into his jacket and placed a small photograph on the table. It was newer than the one from Grace's apartment. Grace stood smiling beside a garden filled with flowers. The sunlight made her appear years younger. Relief flooded through me. She looks happy. She is. Luca nodded. She asked me to show you that. I stared at the picture longer than necessary. When I finally looked up, I realized Luca was watching me with an expression I could not quite understand. Not curiosity. Not suspicion. Something warmer. Something cautious. As though he had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and still could not understand why a schoolteacher had asked for nothing at all. The dinner should have ended there, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. Outside, the snow continued falling in slow white spirals beyond the restaurant windows. The city glowed beneath thousands of lights, distant and beautiful. For the first time since this strange chain of events had begun, I found myself relaxing. Luca was nothing like I had imagined. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about my students, about teaching, about the small details of everyday life that most people overlooked. When I described a science project that had gone spectacularly wrong after one student released 3 classroom frogs during a lesson, he actually laughed. The sound surprised both of us. It transformed his face completely. For a brief moment, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like the boy Grace had written about in her journal. Grace used to tell me stories, he said after the laughter faded. She believed people revealed who they truly were. Through small choices. I glanced at the photograph still resting on the table. That sounds like her. Luca nodded. Most people wanted something from me. Money. Influence. Access. His gaze shifted toward the river. Grace never wanted anything except for me to become a decent man. The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. There was no performance in it. No attempt to impress me. Just truth. I think she would be proud of you, I said quietly. For a second he said nothing. Then he looked away. The reaction told me more than words could have. Before I could say anything else, Luca's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The change in his expression was subtle but immediate. Focus replaced warmth. Responsibility replaced reflection. He answered the call and listened for several moments without speaking. Understood, he finally said. Make sure she is comfortable. My heart skipped. The moment the call ended, I leaned forward. Grace. He nodded. Relief flooded through me. Is she okay? She is fine. A faint smile touched his face. Actually, she is being extremely difficult. I blinked. What? She has spent the last 2 days arguing with staff members because she believes they are giving her too many blankets. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Luca laughed too. She claims nobody needs 6 blankets. That sounds exactly like her. The conversation drifted naturally after that. Yet beneath the warmth I sensed something changing. Not in Luca. In myself. The mystery that had pulled me into this world was beginning to fade. In its place was something simpler. Connection. Understanding. Eventually the restaurant began closing around us. Chairs were quietly moved. Lights dimmed. The evening had slipped away unnoticed. Luca stood as I gathered my coat. There is something I would like to show you, he said. Tomorrow. Curiosity immediately returned. Another mysterious apartment? No, his eyes softened. Someone. My breath caught. Grace. He nodded once. For a moment I could not speak. After everything that had happened, after all the questions and uncertainty, I was finally going to see her again. As we stepped outside into the falling snow, I looked up at the dark winter sky and felt something I had not expected when this story began. Hope. The next afternoon felt longer than an entire school year. Every lesson blurred together. Every clock seemed frozen. By the time the final bell rang, my heart was already somewhere else. A black SUV waited outside my apartment building when I arrived home. Daniel stood beside it wearing the same gray overcoat. Ready? He asked. I nodded without hesitation. The drive carried us beyond the city limits and into the quiet countryside north of Manhattan. Snow covered the fields like a white blanket stretching toward the horizon. 40 minutes later we turned onto a narrow road lined with old maple trees. At the end stood a beautiful stone house surrounded by gardens sleeping beneath winter frost. The moment I stepped from the vehicle, I knew why Grace loved it. It felt peaceful. The front door opened before we reached it. Grace stood there smiling. For a second I could not move. Then I was crossing the distance between us. She wrapped her arms around me and laughed softly. There is my stubborn teacher. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. You disappeared. I know. She squeezed my hands. And I owe you an explanation. We spent the next 2 hours sitting beside a fireplace while she told me everything. How she had spent years helping people. How she had met Luca when he was a frightened young boy carrying burdens no child should carry. How she had tried to teach him that strength and kindness could exist together. He listened more than people think, she said with a smile. Even when he pretended not to. Through the window I could see Luca outside walking slowly through the snow-covered garden. He seemed content simply knowing Grace was safe. Eventually she followed my gaze and smiled knowingly. He likes you. I nearly choked on my tea. Grace. What? Her eyes sparkled. I am old, not blind. Heat rushed to my face. She laughed so hard she had to set down her cup. Later that evening after dinner, I stepped outside for fresh air. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the porch lights. Luca stood near the garden gate looking toward the horizon. I joined him. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Thank you, I finally said, for helping Grace. He shook his head. I owe her more than I can ever repay. I thought about the journal, the photographs, the years of loyalty that connected them. She changed your life. She saved it. His answer came quietly. Then he looked at me. And you reminded me of something I had forgotten. The winter wind stirred around us. What is that? His expression softened. That good people still exist. For a moment neither of us looked away. The city felt very far from this place. The noise, the rush, the endless distractions. All gone. Just snow, silence, and honesty. Months later, life looked surprisingly similar from the outside. I still taught 3rd grade. I still drove my unreliable Honda. My students still brought me crooked drawings and impossible questions. But some things had changed. Grace visited my classroom every few weeks and became everyone's favorite volunteer. Luca donated books to the school library without putting his name on anything. And every now and then, when the world felt especially heavy, the 3 of us shared dinner together. Looking back, it still amazes me how everything began. Not with a grand plan. Not with destiny announcing itself. Just one cold evening. One overlooked person. One small act of kindness. Because sometimes the choices that change our lives are the ones nobody else notices. And sometimes the people we save end up saving us too.